The dawn broke over Texas not with a gentle blush, but with a hard, clean crack of light across the eastern horizon. The sky, a pale, washed-out blue, offered no promise of rain. James Carter felt the familiar dry wind on his face, a wind that carried the scent of dust and cured grass and immense, aching loneliness. From his vantage point on the ridge, his 40,000 acres rolled out before him, a sea of muted golds and browns under the expanding sky. It was a kingdom, his kingdom, and it was as empty as a church on a Monday. His stallion, Tempest, a great black beast with a spirit as restless as the land itself, shifted under him, hooves crunching on the caliche rock. James ran a gloved hand down the horse's powerful neck. The animal was the only living thing that seemed to understand the silence that filled him. He looked toward the ranch headquarters, a collection of sturdy barns and outbuildings huddled around the main house. The house was a fortress, built of thick limestone blocks his father had hauled from the quarry 20 years prior. It was built to withstand Comanche raids, prairie fires, and the endless siege of the Texas sun. It had withstood everything but the quiet that now haunted its high-ceilinged rooms. It was a monument to success, and a tomb for one man's solitude. He turned Tempest back toward the house, the cry of a lone hawk overhead the only sound in the vast emptiness. As he dismounted in the yard, his foreman, Tom Brennan, met him. Tom was a man carved from the same tough material as the land, his face a roadmap of sun and worry. "Morning, James," Tom said, his voice raspy. "Figured you'd be out communing with the sunrise." "It's the quietest time of day," James replied, stripping off his gloves. Tom nodded, his gaze serious. "Maybe so, but the town ain't so quiet. Word is Amos Blake is making another move for the water rights to Willow Creek." James's jaw tightened. Willow Creek was the lifeblood of the Carter Ranch, a slender, tenacious ribbon of water that kept his cattle and his world alive. Amos Blake, the owner of the saloon and a man who collected power the way some men collected coins, had been circling those water rights for a year. "He can make all the moves he wants," James said, his voice low and hard. "I'm not selling." "He's not looking to buy anymore. James, he's talking to the merchants, the ones who hold your credit, whispering about how one man shouldn't control the only reliable water for 3 counties, especially with a dry summer coming on." Inside the cavernous kitchen, the scent of coffee and frying bacon was a small comfort. Rosa, his housekeeper, a stout woman of Mexican descent whose quiet presence was the closest thing to warmth the house possessed, set a plate on the massive oak table. She'd been with his family since before he was born, and her dark, knowing eyes saw more than most. "Mr. Blake is a snake in the grass. Jameson," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle rhythm of her homeland. "He smiles with his teeth, not his eyes." "I'm aware, Rosa," James said, sitting at the head of a table that could seat 20. He ate alone, the scrape of his fork against the plate echoing in the silence. He was 32 years old, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, a man respected and feared in equal measure. But here, in the heart of his own home, he was just a man with a shadow for a companion. The armor he wore in the world a stern expression, a disciplined will, a sharp mind for business felt cold and heavy in the morning light. He had protected his father's legacy, expanded it beyond anyone's dreams, but he'd forgotten how to build a life. 20 miles away, in the dusty, sun-baked town of Willow Falls, Margaret Dawson was already fighting her own quiet battles. At 19, she carried the weight of an orphan's lot with a resilience that was hidden behind a pair of intelligent, watchful gray eyes. In Henderson's Mercantile, she moved with an economy of motion, her hands dusty with flour, her apron smudged with axle grease from a barrel she'd just opened. "A little faster now, Maggie girl, Mr. Henderson said, his voice slick with a familiarity she despised. He leaned too close as she stocked the shelves with tinned peaches, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "A pretty thing like you shouldn't be dawdling." She didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply moved to the next shelf, her spine straight, her dignity a shield he couldn't seem to penetrate. But it was exhausting, this constant vigilance. It was as taxing as hoisting 100-pound sacks of grain. Her world was a cage of small indignities. The way Mr. Henderson's hand brushed her back, the way the town's more respectable ladies, like the formidable widow Eleanor Gable, looked down their noses at her, their gazes dissecting her worn dress, her solitary existence, as if poverty were a moral failing. Maggie endured it all with a quiet grace that few recognized. She was saving every spare penny, a small, secret hoard of coins hidden in a loose floorboard in her tiny room above the store. It wasn't much, but it was a seed of hope. Hope for what? She wasn't always sure. A life where she wasn't at the mercy of a man's whims or a woman's judgment. A life where she could simply be. Her one true luxury, her only taste of freedom, was an indulgence she stole for herself in the quiet hours of the very early morning. It was a small, secluded pool formed by a bend in Willow Creek, hidden by a grove of cottonwoods a mile out of town. There, in the cool, clear water, she could wash away the dust of the town and the grime of the day's humiliations. For 1 hour, she wasn't the orphan, the shop girl. She was just a young woman alone with the sky and the water, her spirit momentarily unbound. It was a baptism, a ritual of self-preservation. She dreamed of it now, the feel of the water on her skin, as she measured out yards of calico for Mrs. Gable, whose lips were pursed in a permanent state of disapproval. Later that day, James rode into Willow Falls. The town was a collection of raw-boned wooden buildings simmering under the relentless sun. Red dust, fine as powder, coated everything. He dismounted in front of the mercantile, the jingle of his spurs a sharp, metallic sound in the afternoon heat. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and pickle brine. He saw her behind the counter, her head bent over a ledger. He'd seen her before. Of course, the orphan girl who worked for Henderson, but he'd never truly looked. Now, he noticed the way a stray strand of honey-blonde hair had escaped her bun, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her clear gray eyes when she finally looked up. There was a quiet strength in her that stood in stark contrast to her surroundings. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice soft but steady. She wasn't flustered by his presence, unlike many in the town. "Miss Dawson," he acknowledged with a curt nod. He gave her his list. As she gathered the items, he saw Henderson emerge from the back room, wiping his greasy hands on his apron. The man's eyes lingered on Maggie in a way that made James's fists clench at his sides. As Maggie weighed out coffee beans, one of the town merchants, a man allied with Amos Blake, approached James. "Afternoon, Carter," the man said, forcing a smile. "Hot one." "It's Texas in the summer," James replied flatly. "Indeed, makes a man think about the future, about water. There's a group of us thinking it's time the town had a more equitable arrangement for Willow Creek. Good for business, good for everyone." The threat was veiled, but clear. "Join us, or we will break you." "The creek runs through my land," James said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "My father dug the wells that feed it in the dry season. It's not for sale. It's not for arrangement." The merchant's smile vanished. A man can find himself mighty isolated, standing alone. James held his gaze, his eyes as hard and unyielding as granite. "I'm accustomed to it." He paid Maggie for his supplies, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second. He saw a flicker of something in them, understanding. Perhaps, or maybe just the shared weariness of a fellow soul fighting a battle no one else could see. He tipped his hat and walked out, the weight of the town's scheming pressing in on him. He was one man against a tide of greed. And for the first time, the fight felt less about land and water and more about a loneliness that was becoming too vast to bear. Back at the ranch, the sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and red. James stood on the porch of his fortress, watching the day die. He had the land, he had the water, he had the power to make men fear him, but he had no one to watch the sunset with. He was the hawk circling a silent sky, master of all he surveyed, and king of nothing at all. He had built walls around his land, and in doing so, had built a taller one around his heart. He didn't know how to breach it, or even if he wanted to. He only knew that the silence inside was growing louder than any threat Amos Blake could muster. The pre-dawn air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth, a rare perfume in the dry heat of a Texas summer. Maggie moved through the silent streets of Willow Falls like a ghost, a small bundle tucked under her arm. This was her time, the only time that belonged wholly to her. The town was asleep, its judgments and its prying eyes temporarily shuttered. Her footsteps were silent in the thick dust of the main road. When she reached the grove of cottonwoods that shielded her sanctuary, the first hint of gray was softening the eastern sky. The leaves whispered secrets to the morning breeze. Here. Willow Creek slowed and deepened, carving a small, clear pool out of the limestone bedrock. The water was her confessor, her absolution. It asked for nothing and washed everything away. She slipped out of her simple dress and chemise, her movements unhurried and graceful in the dim light. For a moment, she stood at the water's edge, a slender silhouette against the coming dawn. This was not an act of vanity, but one of reclamation. Here, she was not the orphan or the shop girl. She was simply Margaret, a creation of bone and spirit, as elemental as the water and the stone. The first touch of the water was a shock, a cold clench that stole her breath and then gave it back. Renewed. She submerged herself completely, the long strands of her hair fanning out around her like a silken halo, the grit of the town, the lingering feel of Mr. Henderson's unwelcome proximity, the sting of Mrs. Gable's disdain. It all dissolved in the clean, cold embrace of the creek. She surfaced, gasping, a smile touching her lips. This was freedom. The water held her, buoyant and weightless. She tilted her head back, floating, watching the stars fade one by one into the growing light. James Carter was riding the fence line along the creek for the third time that week. The pressure from Amos Blake and his cronies had settled in his gut like a cold stone. They wanted his water, and they were methodically turning the town against him to get it. He needed to check for any signs of tampering, any breaks in the wire that might let his cattle stray or another man's wander onto his pasture. Tempest moved with a quiet, powerful rhythm. His ears pricked forward. James was lost in thought, calculating feed costs against the falling price of beef, planning his defense against Blake's next move, when the horse suddenly stopped, lifting its head and letting out a low snort. James pulled gently on the reins, his eyes scanning the dense brush along the creek bank. A deer, perhaps, or a coyote. He heard a soft splash, a sound that didn't belong to the normal chatter of the creek. He guided Tempest forward, parting the low-hanging branches of a willow. And then he saw her. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, the world stopped. He saw a flash of pale skin in the crystalline water, the curve of a shoulder, the dark, wet tangle of her hair. It was the girl from the mercantile, Maggie Dawson. His mind, usually so quick and decisive, went completely blank. He was not a rancher, not a landowner, not an adversary of Amos Blake. He was just a man, stunned into silence by an unexpected and profoundly private vision of beauty. He saw her face, turned up to the sky, her eyes closed in a look of pure serenity. And in that instant, he understood. This wasn't for anyone else. This was for her. He had intruded on something sacred. Shame, hot and sharp, washed over him. He yanked Tempest's reins so hard the horse reared back, its hooves skittering on the rocks. The sound shattered the morning peace. Maggie's eyes flew open. She saw the massive shape of the horse and rider, a dark silhouette against the brightening sky. A scream caught in her throat, strangled by terror. She scrambled in the water, trying to cover herself, her mind a whirlwind of panic. It was him, the rancher, James Carter. "My apologies, miss," his voice boomed, rough with shock. He had already turned his horse, deliberately and completely, presenting his back to her. I was checking the fence line. I'll go." He didn't wait for a reply. He spurred Tempest, and the sound of the horse crashing through the undergrowth was a brutal violation of the morning's quiet. In seconds, he was gone. Maggie was left trembling in the cold water, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sanctuary had been breached. The one place she had felt safe and free was now the scene of her deepest humiliation. She scrambled onto the bank, her hands shaking so badly she could barely pull her clothes on over her damp skin. The sun was rising, but all she felt was a bone-deep chill. She prayed, with all the fervor of her being, that the moment would simply disappear, that it would be their secret, buried and forgotten. But secrets had no place to grow in the shallow, rocky soil of Willow Falls. By noon, the story had taken root. A farmhand, heading to town with a wagon of melons, had seen Carter's big black stallion tearing away from the cottonwood grove as if the devil himself were on his heels. Later, he'd seen the Dawson girl hurrying back toward town on foot, looking pale and frightened. That was all it took. A spark on dry tinder. By the time the tale reached the saloon, Amos Blake was holding court. He polished the story, shaped it, gave it a new and ugly meaning. "Carter," you say, Blake said, leaning against his polished bar, a smirk playing on his lips. Riding hard from the creek at dawn, and the little mercantile mouse scurrying home right after a man of his appetites, and a girl with no family to protect her. Draw your own conclusions. Gentlemen." The men at the bar chuckled, their imaginations filling in the sordid details Blake so expertly implied. The story spread from the saloon to the smithy, from the livery to the front porches. It was a juicy piece of gossip, all the more delicious because it involved the cold, untouchable James Carter and the quiet, unassuming orphan girl. The town, resentful of Carter's wealth and power, was eager to believe the worst of him, and a woman of Maggie's station was always an easy target. The water that had been her baptism was now, in the town's telling, the scene of her ruin. Maggie felt the change the moment she stepped behind the counter after her lunch. "Mr. Henderson's leer was more pronounced, his questions about her morning walk pointed and invasive. Customers who usually gave her a polite nod now stared, their eyes lingering, their whispers ceasing the moment she looked their way. The worst was Mrs. Gable. She came in for a spool of thread and fixed Maggie with a look of pure venom. "Some girls," the widow said, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear, "have no sense of decency. They make their beds, and then they are surprised when they are forced to lie in them." Maggie's face burned, but she kept her eyes down, her hands clenched tightly in the folds of her apron. Her dignity, the one thing she had fought so hard to protect, was being stripped from her, piece by piece, in front of the whole town. James heard the rumors 2 days later when Tom Brennan rode back from picking up supplies. The foreman was blunt. "They're saying you and the Dawson girl were together, down at the creek," Tom said, his discomfort obvious. "Amos Blake is making sure the story gets around to everyone who'll listen. He's painting it ugly. James." A cold rage, clean and precise, settled over James. He thought of the look on her face when she had floated in the water, a look of peace he had never seen on another human being. He thought of her terror when she saw him. And he thought of the vipers in town, twisting an accident, a moment of intrusion, into a weapon to hurt them both. They were using her to get to him. His decision was instantaneous. It was bold, it was reckless, and it felt more right than anything he had done in years. It was an act of defiance, a strategic move, and though he would not admit it to himself, a lifeline thrown to another solitary soul. He saddled Tempest and rode into town, ignoring the stares and the sudden silences that followed him. He dismounted in front of the mercantile and walked in, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. The store was busy. Mrs. Gable was there, as was Mr. Henderson. Maggie stood behind the counter, looking pale and exhausted, like a flower deprived of sun. He walked directly to her, his shadow falling over her. The entire store went silent. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice clear and steady, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I have a proposition for you. I'm in need of someone to manage the logistics of my household and ranch supplies. It requires a sharp mind and a capacity for hard work. The position pays 3 times what you are making here and includes room and board at the ranch. The job is yours, if you want it." A collective gasp went through the store. Henderson's jaw dropped. Maggie stared at him, her gray eyes wide with disbelief, confusion, and a tiny, flickering ember of hope. He was offering her a shield. He was offering her an escape in the face of the town's condemnation. He was publicly choosing to stand with her. The clear, clean water of the creek had become a torrent of scandal, and James Carter had just decided to ride straight into the flood. The wagon ride to the Carter Ranch was the longest 20 miles of Maggie's life. With every turn of the wheels, she left behind the only world she had ever known, a world of narrow confines and petty cruelties. Ahead lay the unknown, a vast expanse of land lorded over by a man she barely knew, a man who had, in one public gesture, either saved her or sealed her fate. Her small bundle of belongings rested on the seat beside her, a meager testament to a life lived on the margins. The main house rose from the plains not like a home, but like a geological formation. It was immense, imposing, built of limestone blocks that seemed to absorb the fierce Texas sunlight and radiate a cold authority. It made her feel smaller than she ever had in her cramped room above the mercantile. This was not a house, it was a fortress, and she was walking into its very heart. Rosa met her at the door, her face impassive but her dark eyes kind. She took Maggie's bundle with a gentle firmness. "Welcome, child. Your room is ready. The master is out with the herds." Rosa's presence was an immediate comfort, a quiet anchor in this overwhelming new reality. She led Maggie through cool, high-ceilinged rooms filled with heavy, dark furniture. The silence was profound, a living entity that seemed to press in from all sides. Tom Brennan saw her from the porch and gave her a slow, appraising nod. It was not a welcome, precisely, but it was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that she had faced the town's scorn and had not broken. It was more than she had expected. Maggie took to her work with the quiet, ferocious efficiency of someone who had never known a moment's rest. James Carter had given her the title of Household and Logistics Manager, and she was determined to earn it. She spent her first days in the ranch office, a room smelling of leather and old paper, poring over the ledgers, her mind, sharp and hungry for order, quickly found the patterns, the waste, the vulnerabilities. She discovered they were buying barrels of salt pork and sacks of flour from a merchant in Willow Falls, known to be in Amos Blake's pocket, paying nearly a third more than market price. Within a week, she had arranged a new contract with a supplier from a town 50 miles down the new railway line, saving the ranch a considerable sum. She reorganized the storerooms, implemented a system for tracking inventory, and her neat, precise handwriting began to fill the pages of the ledgers, bringing a clarity to the business that had been missing. Tom Brennan, who initially viewed her with a foreman's skepticism, was the first to be won over. He came to her with a request for a dozen new branding irons before the fall roundup. Instead of simply placing the order, she showed him how they could save money by purchasing the raw iron and having the ranch's own blacksmith forge them. "Damn, girl," he'd said, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face. "The boss wasn't wrong about you having a sharp mind." Rosa, for her part, simply watched and protected. She made sure Maggie ate, that she found her way around the sprawling house, and deflected the curious questions of the ranch hands' wives. She saw the deep weariness behind Maggie's composure and offered her silent companionship, a shared cup of coffee in the warm kitchen, a quiet word of encouragement. The most difficult part of her new life was the evenings. Dinner was served precisely at 7 in the cavernous dining hall. She and James would sit at opposite ends of the massive oak table, the polished wood reflecting the flickering lamplight between them like a dark, still river. The distance felt deliberate, a carefully maintained boundary. The silence, which she had found peaceful in her room, was amplified here, made heavy with unspoken things. Their first few meals were painfully awkward, the conversation limited to polite inquiries about the ranch or the weather. He was a guarded, solitary man, and she was a young woman who had learned that speaking her mind was a dangerous luxury. But slowly, tentatively, the walls began to crack. "One evening," he asked, "your family, Miss Dawson, are they from Texas?" She looked down at her plate, her hands still for a moment. "I don't have any family. Mr. Carter, they passed from fever when I was a child." He was silent for a long moment. She risked a glance and saw not pity in his eyes, but a flicker of something else. Recognition. "My father built this ranch from nothing," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "We lived in a sod dugout for the first 3 years. I remember the hunger, the cold, this table. This was his dream. Sometimes I think he forgot how to live in it once he'd built it." It was the first piece of himself he had ever offered her, a story not of his wealth, but of his roots in poverty and struggle. It was a bridge across the long, dark table. After that, the silences became more comfortable, punctuated by small revelations. She learned he had 2 younger brothers who had left Texas for the goldfields of Colorado, breaking their father's heart. He learned that she had taught herself to read using an old Bible and a tattered almanac she'd found in a trash heap. They developed a quiet language of gestures. When the pressure of his fight with Amos Blake was weighing on him, he would turn his coffee cup in slow, precise circles on the saucer, his knuckles white, when she felt a wave of uncertainty, or when his direct gaze made her heart beat a little faster. She would raise a hand and smooth back a stray wisp of hair from her temple, a small, unconscious gesture of composure. The pressure from outside the ranch continued to mount. The economic boycott Amos Blake had orchestrated was beginning to bite. A long-standing contract to provide beef to a mining company was abruptly canceled. The bank in Willow Falls suddenly called in a loan on a piece of equipment. James met each new challenge with a grim, unbending will. But Maggie could see the toll it was taking. He spent longer hours in the saddle, and the lines around his eyes deepened. Eleanor Gable, the town's self-appointed moral arbiter, made it her personal mission to fan the flames of the scandal. She spoke loudly in the mercantile of unseemly arrangements and hinted that Maggie had secured her position not with her mind, but with a shameful bargain. The whispers followed Maggie whenever she had to ride into town for supplies, poisoning the air around her. One afternoon, she was watching the ranch hands' children. There were nearly a dozen of them, ranging in age from 5 to 12, left to their own devices while their parents worked. They were bright, wild, and growing up with no education, destined to follow their parents into a life of hard labor with no other prospects. An idea, bold and clear, took shape in her mind. That evening at dinner, after the plates had been cleared, she did not retreat into her usual quiet. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest, "I have a proposal." He looked up, his attention captured by her formal tone. "Go on." "The children on this ranch," she said, "they have nothing to occupy their minds. There is an old line shack near the bunkhouse that isn't being used. With some simple repairs and a few benches, it could be made into a schoolroom. I could teach them their letters and numbers in the afternoons." James stared at her down the length of the table. He was a pragmatist, a man who thought in terms of profit and loss, acreage, and cattle. A school seemed like a frivolous distraction from the war he was fighting. "We are a ranch, Miss Dawson, not a town," he said, his tone dismissive. "I pay their fathers to work cattle, not to have their children educated." Her chin lifted. The gesture was small, but it was defiant. And what future will they have to be cowboys who can't read their own pay slips, to be wives who can't write a letter to their own kin? An education is not a luxury. Mr. Carter, it is a tool for building a life, a better one. He saw it then. This wasn't just a charitable impulse. This was the core of who she was. This was her own quiet, desperate fight for dignity, expanded to include others. He looked at this young woman, who had been scorned and slandered, who had every reason to be consumed with her own survival, and saw that her deepest desire was to build something for others. The idea was impractical. It was inconvenient, and it struck him with the force of a revelation. In her dream for a small, dusty schoolroom, he saw a vision of a world beyond his fences, beyond the lonely accumulation of wealth and power. It was a seed of community, of legacy, of a life with purpose beyond himself. He leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the lamplight, the armor around his heart, so carefully constructed over years of solitude, felt a little bit lighter. "Get Tom to help you with the repairs," he said gruffly, turning his gaze to the dark window, "and make me a list of the supplies you'll need." He said nothing more, but as Maggie lay in her bed that night, the vast silence of the stone house seemed different. It no longer felt empty. It felt like it was waiting. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the window frames, carrying the scent of dust and distant, gathering clouds. The day died slowly, suffocated by a heat that was thick and wet and heavy in the lungs. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a bruised, yellowish gray, and the air was so still that the buzz of a horsefly sounded like a saw blade. The usual dry wind had vanished, leaving a dead, breathless calm that felt more threatening than the fiercest gale. Even the cattle in the home pasture were restless, huddled together and lowing softly, their instincts telling them what the sky was not yet admitting. Maggie stood on the long porch of the main house, a list of school supplies in her hand, but her eyes were fixed on the western horizon. A dark, ugly line of clouds was building there, stacked and angry. She had lived in Texas long enough to know what that particular shade of purple meant. Rosa came to stand beside her, wiping her hands on her apron. "He is still out," Rosa said. It was not a question. He rode to the North Range to check on the new well. "He knows the signs," Maggie said, trying to convince herself as much as the older woman. "He'll turn back soon." But the hours crept by, and the line of clouds grew into a monstrous wall that consumed the sun and began to bleed across the sky. The light failed, plunging the world into a strange, premature twilight. A nervous energy hummed in the air, raising the hairs on Maggie's arms. She couldn't stay inside. She felt a primal need to watch, to wait. Her concern for him was a tight, unfamiliar knot in her chest. He was her employer, her protector, but in the quiet moments over the long dinner table, he had become something more, a fellow soul she was just beginning to recognize. The first gust of wind hit the house like a physical blow, rattling the windows and slamming a loose shutter with a crack that made her jump. It carried the first fat, cold drops of rain. Within minutes, the deluge began, a solid sheet of water that blurred the world into a gray chaos. The wind shrieked, tearing at the leaves of the ancient cottonwoods, and the sky began to flicker with silent, internal flashes of lightning. And still, he was not back. She stood on the porch, one hand gripping a wooden pillar, the wind whipping her skirts around her and plastering stray strands of hair to her face. Rosa had tried to coax her inside, but she had refused. Her gaze locked on the road from the North Range. Every flash of lightning illuminated a landscape in turmoil, empty and terrifying. The knot in her chest had tightened into a cold, hard stone of fear. Then, through the roar of the wind and rain, she saw him, a dark shape, moving steadily through the maelstrom. It was Tempest, head lowered against the wind, his powerful legs eating up the muddy ground. James was a hunched figure in the saddle, his hat pulled low, his duster soaked and black with rain. A wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over Maggie. She didn't move until he had swung the big horse into the relative shelter of the stables. A few minutes later, he was striding toward the house, his boots sinking into the mud, his face grim and set against the storm. He mounted the porch steps, water streaming from him, and for a moment, they just stood there, 2 feet apart, the screaming wind and the crashing thunder their only conversation. His eyes, dark and intense, found hers. He saw the genuine fear and relief on her face, and something in his own stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You should be inside," he shouted over the wind. "So should you," she shouted back, a small, watery smile touching her lips. He was about to answer when the world exploded in a simultaneous blast of white light and a deafening, tearing crack of thunder that seemed to come from directly overhead. The porch boards shuddered beneath their feet. The sound was immediately followed by the sharp, sickening crash of shattering glass from the north side of the house. "Damn it!" James roared. He was already moving, pushing past her into the house. The old study. Maggie followed him without a second's hesitation. They ran through the dark, echoing halls to the north wing. The wind was howling through the house itself, a feral beast that had broken its leash. In the old study, a room filled with his father's books and maps. One of the massive windows had been completely blown out, the frame splintered and blackened. Wind and rain were pouring in, soaking the thick carpets, tearing at the curtains, sending loose papers flying like frantic birds. The lamps had been blown out, plunging the room into a chaotic darkness punctuated by the violent flashes of lightning outside. "The cellar doors," James yelled, his voice barely audible. "The old ones. In the pantry, we can board it up from the inside." They worked in the frantic, efficient rhythm of 2 people fighting a common enemy. It was all strength and decisive action, ripping the heavy, plank-like cellar doors from their hinges. She was quick and resourceful, finding a hammer and a jar of nails in a nearby tool closet, her mind working with a clarity born of pure adrenaline. In the strobing, disorienting flashes of lightning, they wrestled the heavy wooden doors against the gaping window frame. The wind fought them, a malevolent force trying to push them back. Rain lashed their faces, cold and stinging. Twice, a powerful gust nearly tore the heavy planking from his hands, but she was there, throwing her entire weight against it. Her shoulder pressed against his back, adding her strength to his. They were not a man and a woman, an employer and his charge. They were partners, a bulwark against the chaos. He hammered the nails home with powerful, rhythmic blows, the sound a steady counterpoint to the storm's fury. When the last nail was sunk, they sagged against their handiwork, chests heaving, soaked to the skin. The roar of the wind was muffled, the direct assault of the rain blocked. They had won. They were left in an almost absolute darkness. The only sounds, the continued rumble of thunder and the drumming of rain on the roof. They were both breathing hard. She could feel the warmth of him beside her, could smell the rain and the clean scent of ozone that clung to his clothes. "Stay here," he said, his voice rough. He fumbled his way out of the room and returned a moment later with an oil lamp, its small, steady flame pushing back the shadows and casting a warm, golden glow on their faces. In the gentle light, she saw that his cheek was bleeding from a shallow cut, probably from a piece of flying glass. He saw the way her wet dress clung to her, the exhaustion and the lingering fear in her wide gray eyes. The formal distance of the dinner table was gone, washed away by the storm. "You're freezing," he stated, his voice now quiet and concerned. He led her to the great stone fireplace in the main hall, where a few embers still glowed. He added logs from the woodbox, and soon a cheerful fire was crackling, its light dancing on the dark wood and stone. He disappeared and returned with a thick wool blanket and a bottle of whiskey. He poured a small amount into 2 glasses. "For the chill," he said, handing one to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The simple contact sent a jolt through her, as startling as the lightning. She took a sip. The whiskey was fire in her throat, but it sent a welcome heat spreading through her limbs. He tossed the rest of his back in one swallow. They stood before the fire, wrapped in the blanket he had draped over her shoulders. Not speaking for a long time. The storm outside was their excuse, the shared danger a bridge between their 2 solitudes. "I was afraid," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "When you were out there, I was afraid." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "There was a moment," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "when the lightning hit a tree not 50 yards from me, I thought—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. In that small, firelit space, surrounded by the vast, storm-tossed darkness, they were no longer James Carter, the powerful rancher, and Maggie Dawson, the orphan girl. They were just 2 people who had looked into the abyss and found a human hand to cling to. A particularly violent clap of thunder shook the house, rattling the very stones in the hearth. Maggie flinched, a small, involuntary movement. Instinctively, he put an arm around her, pulling her closer to his side. It was not a gesture of romance, but of pure, simple comfort, of protection. She leaned into his strength, resting her head against his chest. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm of life and resilience that was the antithesis of the storm's chaos. He was warm and real, a fortress far more reassuring than the stone walls around them. For the first time in her memory, she felt completely, utterly safe. He stood perfectly still, his arm holding her, the scent of her damp hair filling his senses. He was holding not just a woman, but a warmth, a life, a quiet courage that humbled him. The loneliness that had been his constant companion felt, for the first time, like a distant country he had no desire to revisit. They stayed that way for a long time, listening to the storm die down, the blanket and the fire and their shared presence a small, defiant pocket of warmth in the cold. Wet night. They did not speak again. There was nothing that needed to be said. The following day, the story that reached Willow Falls was not one of courage and cooperation. It was a dark, twisted version, born of speculation and malice. A ranch hand, sent to town for a new pane of glass, spoke of the shattered window in the north wing and the fact that the Dawson girl had been in the main house all night. Amos Blake heard the news, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. A storm in a house, a man and a woman, alone. It was a gift. It was a weapon he could use to destroy James Carter once and for all, by aiming straight at the heart of his newfound vulnerability. The storm passed, but it left the air charged and volatile. In Willow Falls, the whispers that had followed the night of the storm coalesced into a hard, ugly certainty. The story, nurtured by Amos Blake and broadcast by Eleanor Gable, was no longer about a shared crisis, but a sordid, calculated affair. Maggie Dawson, the cunning orphan, had spent the night with James Carter. The conclusion, in the town's mind, was inescapable. For a week, Maggie remained within the stone walls of the ranch, a sanctuary that was beginning to feel like a cage. She threw herself into her work, finalizing the plans for the small schoolhouse. But the unspoken tension was a constant presence. The politeness between her and James had returned, but it was now threaded with a new awareness. The memory of his arm around her in the firelight, a ghost that lingered between them. She knew she could not hide forever. The supplies for the school slate boards, chalk Primers were waiting for her in town. She chose a Saturday to make the trip, a market day, knowing the town would be crowded. It was a conscious act of defiance, a refusal to let their judgment imprison her. She rode in the buckboard, her back straight, her hands clenched in her lap, feeling like a soldier marching into a battle she was certain to lose. The moment she stepped down onto the dusty main street, the air grew still. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. She kept her eyes fixed on the entrance to the Mercantile, her one-time prison. Now a destination she had to conquer. Inside, Mr. Henderson greeted her with a greasy, knowing smirk. Well, look who's come back to visit us common folk. She ignored him, placing her list on the counter. But as she waited, a formidable shadow fell over her. It was Eleanor Gable, flanked by two other women from the church sewing circle, their faces masks of pious indignation. "I am surprised you have the audacity to show your face here. Girl, Mrs." Gable began, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent store. "After your disgraceful conduct." Maggie's face flushed with heat, but she met the older woman's gaze. "My conduct has been honorable." "Mrs.?" Gable let out a short, sharp laugh that was devoid of humor. "Honorable luring a man like James Carter, trapping him alone in that house during a storm. We all know what kind of bargain you struck to get your position. It is a shame to the decent women of this town." "That's not what happened," Maggie said, her voice trembling but clear. "Oh, I'm sure," one of the other women chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "A poor, helpless orphan. It's an old story." The circle was tightening. Customers had stopped pretending to shop and were now openly watching, their faces a mixture of curiosity and condemnation. Maggie was alone, an island in a sea of hostility. She was 19 years old, and she was being publicly branded, her name, her very character, destroyed before her eyes. Then, the heavy doors of the Mercantile swung open, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. James Carter stood there, framed in the doorway. He was not dressed for ranch work, but in a clean shirt and his good town coat. His eyes, cold as a winter sky, swept the room, taking in the scene in an instant Maggie, pale and cornered, Eleanor Gable, her face flushed with righteous fury, the avid, hungry faces of the onlookers. He moved with a deadly quiet grace, his spurs ringing out the only sound in the suffocating silence. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He walked directly to the counter and stood beside Maggie, his presence a solid, unbreachable wall. He looked at Eleanor Gable, and the woman, for all her bluster, visibly flinched. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice low and laced with steel, "you will apologize to Miss Dawson." The widow sputtered, her face turning a mottled red. "I will do no such thing. She has brought disgrace upon—" "You will apologize," James repeated, his voice dropping even lower, "for speaking ill of my future wife." A collective, audible gasp swept through the store. Maggie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock, staring at his profile. Mr. Henderson looked as if he might faint. Eleanor Gable's mouth opened and closed like a beached fish. James placed a hand gently on the small of Maggie's back. "We're leaving," he said softly. For her alone, he turned to the crowd. "If I hear one more word spoken against her," he said, his gaze sweeping over them all, "you will find that my memory is very long, and my business is very portable." He guided her out of the store, through the stunned crowd that parted for them like the Red Sea. He helped her into the buckboard, his touch firm and steadying. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a sharp click, drove them out of the heart of Willow Falls, leaving a maelstrom of shock and speculation in their wake. They rode in silence, the clatter of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of the horses the only sounds. He did not head back toward the ranch. Instead, he turned down the familiar track that led toward Willow Creek. He drove them into the shade of the great, ancient cottonwood that stood sentinel over the very pool where he had first seen her. He pulled the horses to a halt and set the brake. The quiet of the grove settled around them, a stark contrast to the ugliness in town. The leaves whispered overhead, and the creek gurgled softly nearby. Maggie was the first to break the silence, her voice a ragged whisper. She could not look at him. She stared at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "You didn't have to do that, lie for me like that." "It wasn't a lie," he said, his voice quiet. She finally turned to face him, her gray eyes swimming with confusion and a deep, aching pain. "But why, you saw them? You heard them. They've ruined my name. I have nothing. No family. No money." She took a shaky breath, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperate honesty. A last-ditch effort to save him from his own chivalry. "You don't want a virgin like me. Not one who carries this kind of scandal. I'm just a girl with no dowry and a name they've dragged through the mud." The word virgin hung in the air between them, a testament to her innocence and the town's cruel, ironic judgment. James turned on the seat, his whole body angled toward her. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, a smile that reached his eyes and seemed to melt the cold armor he had worn for so long. It was the smile of a man laying down a heavy burden. He took a deep breath, like a man who had been holding it for a lifetime. "That's all I want," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He reached out and gently took her trembling hands in his own. "That's all I've ever wanted. I don't want a dowry. I don't want a name. I want you, Margaret, just you, whole and true, exactly as you are." Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back began to slip down her cheeks. He raised a hand and gently brushed one away with his thumb. "They made a choice in that store," he said, his gaze holding hers. "They chose malice. Now I'm making mine. I chose you a long time ago. I think right here, by this creek." He took another breath. "Margaret Dawson, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" It was not a flowery speech. There were no grand promises of romance. It was simple, solid, and real. It was a foundation stone laid in the midst of a battlefield. It was everything. "Yes," she whispered, the word a quiet affirmation in the rustling leaves. "Yes, James." The wedding was planned for the following day. There was no time for invitations or finery. This was not a celebration. It was a declaration. James sent a rider for Reverend Miller, but the man sent back a note filled with stammering excuses, his spine clearly having been bent by the pressure of Amos Blake's allies. "He's afraid," Tom Brennan said, spitting on the ground. "The whole town's afraid of Blake." "Then we will find a man who is not," James said, his jaw set. He sent another rider, this one on his fastest horse, to fetch the circuit judge from the county seat, a man whose authority came from the law, not from local opinion. The next afternoon, a small group gathered on the wide porch of the stone house. Maggie wore her simple Sunday dress, her hair neatly braided. Rosa stood beside her, her dark eyes shining with tears. Tom Brennan was James's witness. The judge, a stern-faced man with a healthy respect for the Carter name, opened his book. Just as he was about to begin, a frantic rider came galloping into the yard, his horse lathered. "Fire!" he yelled, pointing to the south. "On the south range, it's moving fast." Everyone turned. In the distance, against the clear blue sky, a thick column of greasy black smoke was rising, a malevolent pillar marking Amos Blake's reply. It was meant to pull James away, to humiliate him, to prove that even on his wedding day, he could not protect his own land. Tom looked at James, his face grim. "I'll take the men." James shook his head. He looked from the rising smoke to Maggie's face. He saw her fear, but also her resolve. He had made his choice. He would not be moved. "The fire can wait," James said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He turned back to the judge. Proceed. And so, as the men of the Carter Ranch rode out to fight the flames of hatred that licked at their livelihood, James Carter and Margaret Dawson were married. The judge's words were spoken against a backdrop of distant, rising smoke. Their vows were not whispered in a quiet church, but declared on a windswept porch, a promise of fidelity to each other and an act of open defiance to the world that had tried to tear them apart. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, James turned to her, and his kiss was not one of passion, but of profound, unwavering commitment. It was a seal on a pact made in the heart of a fire, a promise to build a new life from the ashes. Their honeymoon was measured in acres of scorched earth. The fire, set by Amos Blake's men, had been a wedding present of pure malice. It had destroyed 1,000 acres of prime winter grazing land before Tom Brennan and the ranch hands, exhausted and smoke-blackened, had finally beaten it back. The act was meant to be a crippling blow, a demonstration of Blake's reach and his contempt for their union. But as James and Maggie stood on the porch in the days that followed, the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the air, they found it had forged something unexpected between them, a shared, steely resolve. The retaliation, however, had only just begun. It came not with the roar of a fire, but with the quiet, deadly precision of a snake in the dark. A week after the wedding, a cattle contract with an army outpost, a contract the Carter family had held for 2 decades, was summarily canceled with a curt, one-sentence telegram. 2 days later, a ranch hand found a dozen steers lying dead around a watering hole on the western range, their bodies bloated. The water was poisoned. The violence became personal when Tom Brennan rode into the yard one evening, slumping in his saddle, his left arm bound in a bloody bandana. He'd been ambushed on the road from town by 3 men. They hadn't tried to kill him, he explained, just beat him badly. It was a message, delivered with fists and a pistol butt. The old sheriff in Willow Falls, a man long in Amos Blake's debt, listened to Tom's report with a bored expression and concluded there was nothing he could do without witnesses. That night, the fortress of the main house felt like a besieged outpost. After Rosa had cleaned and dressed Tom's wounds, James found Maggie in the study, staring out the newly repaired window into the oppressive darkness. The strain of the past weeks had etched fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but her gaze was clear and unwavering. "This has gone far enough," James said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He had been pacing the length of the room, his movements coiled and restless like a caged wolf. He put his hands on my foreman. "He's coming after my people, after you." He stopped in front of her. "I'm sending you to Austin. I have friends there. You'll be safe until I've dealt with Blake." Maggie turned from the window, her expression hardening. The soft, uncertain girl he had met by the creek was gone, replaced by the woman who had faced down a mob in the Mercantile. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "This isn't a discussion. Margaret," he said, his protective instincts overriding everything else. "It's too dangerous here. I won't have you in the line of fire." "And I won't be sent away like a piece of fragile cargo," she countered, her chin lifting. "You married me in front of a fire," he started. "James, did you think I would run from the heat? I am your wife. My place is here, with you. We fight this together, or we lose everything separately." He saw the unbending strength in her, the same strength that had allowed her to survive her whole life. To send her away would not be to protect her. It would be to deny who she was. It would be an insult to the very spirit he had fallen in love with. The tension in his shoulders eased, replaced by a wave of fierce, reluctant pride. This was his wife, his partner. "All right," he said, the word a surrender and a vow. "Together." From that moment, the dynamic of their war shifted. It was no longer just his strength against Blake's cunning. It was their combined intelligence against a network of corruption. While James rode the fences, organizing his men into armed patrols, Maggie began her own, quieter campaign. She spent her days in the ranch office, But she wasn't just managing ledgers anymore. She was gathering intelligence. She started with the ranch's own canceled contracts, writing letters to the companies, asking for formal explanations. Then she began a more dangerous task. She sent a trusted young ranch hand, the son of one of the vaqueros, into Willow Falls. He was a boy the townsfolk barely noticed. He sat in the saloon, nursing a single beer, his ears open. He loitered near the loading docks and the bank, and he brought back whispers. He brought back names of merchants who were being squeezed by Blake, farmers who had lost their land in crooked card games, men who had taken loans from Blake at exorbitant rates. Maggie meticulously recorded every piece of information in a new, separate ledger. Locked in James's desk, a pattern of debt, blackmail, and fraud began to emerge. Amos Blake didn't just own the saloon, he owned the town's fear. James, meanwhile, reached out to his own allies. He sent riders not to other cattlemen who were too easily intimidated by Blake's local power, but to men of a different sort. He wrote to an old friend who ran a silver mine in the mountains to the west, a man who understood how to deal with claim jumpers and thieves. He sent a telegram to a superintendent of the railroad, a man whose friendship he had earned by granting the railroad undisputed passage through a corner of his land years ago. These were hard men, men who operated outside the petty tyrannies of a town like Willow Falls. One evening, as they worked side by side at the big desk in the study, the lamplight casting their shared shadow on the wall, Maggie looked up from her ledger. "Your brothers," she said. "In Colorado, is the rift between you so great they would not come if you asked?" James's face tightened. "They chose gold over this land. My father never forgave them. I'm not sure I have either." "This isn't about forgiveness," Maggie said gently, pushing a piece of paper and a pen toward him. "This is about family and legacy. Blake isn't just trying to destroy you, James. He's trying to erase the Carter name from this valley. Your father's name. Tell them that. Don't command them. Just tell them what's at stake, and ask." He stared at the blank page for a long time. Then, with a deep sigh, he picked up the pen and began to write. The response came a week later, a 3-word telegram. "Coming home. Stop." The night it happened was dark and moonless. A scout James had posted on the ridge overlooking the town road galloped in, his horse breathing hard. "They're coming, boss. At least 30 of them. Blake's leading." The siege had begun. There was no panic. They had been preparing for this. The ranch hands, armed and ready, took their positions in the darkened barns and behind the stone walls of the main yard. Rosa led Maggie not to the cellar, but to the second-floor study, handing her an old shotgun. "You know how to use this, child," she said grimly. From the window, they could see them, dark figures on horseback, spreading out to form a loose, menacing circle around the ranch headquarters. They were not a disciplined force, but a drunken, confident mob, emboldened by their numbers. A voice, amplified by the night's stillness, called out. It was Amos Blake. "Carter, we just want the water rights, sign the papers, and no one gets hurt. You're alone in there." James stood in the deep shadow of the porch, a Winchester rifle held loosely in his hands. He did not answer. He was waiting. Maggie, her heart pounding, watched from the window above. She saw him lift a shielded lantern and signal 3 times toward the dark, empty plains to the east. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Blake laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "No one's coming to save you, Carter." And then the night came alive. From the east, a line of riders appeared, materializing out of the darkness like vengeful ghosts. They were backlit by a rising sliver of moon, their forms lean and hard in the saddle. They were James's brothers, Ethan and Caleb, leading a dozen hardened men from the Colorado goldfields. At the same moment, another group appeared from the south, a disciplined line of men with railroad rifles, moving with quiet efficiency. From the west, the miners, tough and silent, emerged from a dry wash, effectively closing the trap. Amos Blake's mob was no longer a ring of predators. They were the ones in the cage. Panic erupted. A few nervous shots were fired into the air. James's voice boomed through the night, clear and cold. "Throw down your guns. You are surrounded." Blake, his face a mask of disbelief and fury in the sudden light of torches lit by the railroad men, pulled his pistol. He aimed not at James, but at the house, at the lighted window where he knew Maggie must be. He never fired. A single shot cracked from the porch, James's Winchester. It was not a killing shot. He had aimed for the arm. Blake cried out, his pistol clattering to the ground. The fight went out of the mob instantly. Faced with a superior, disciplined force that had appeared from nowhere, they threw down their weapons, their drunken courage evaporating into the night air. The standoff was over, but the true victory came at dawn, as James's brothers and his allies held Blake's men under guard. A new rider approached the ranch. He was a tall, lean man with a square jaw and an honest face, and he wore the gleaming badge of a U.S. Marshal. Beside him rode the new county sheriff he had just appointed. The marshal dismounted, holding a warrant. He strode up to Amos Blake, who was slumped against a wagon wheel, nursing his wounded arm. "Amos Blake," the marshal said, his voice ringing with the authority of federal law, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy." He held up a second document, and this is a court order, based on evidence provided by Mrs. Margaret Carter, to open a full investigation into your business dealings and the corrupt practices of this county. Maggie watched from the porch as they led Blake away. Her ledger, filled with the whispers and grievances of a terrorized town, had become a weapon more powerful than any gun. The battle had been won not just by rifles in the night, but by ink on a page, by a woman's courage, and by a community of allies who had answered the call. Justice, it turned out, could be built, piece by piece, even in the heart of the lawless West. The fall after Amos Blake's arrest was a season of uneasy quiet. The machinery of the law, set in motion by the U.S. Marshal, ground slowly, untangling the web of debt and fear Blake had woven around Willow Falls. The town, raw and ashamed, began the slow, painful process of looking at itself in the mirror. The Carters were no longer pariahs, but they were not yet neighbors. They were an institution, respected for their strength, but held at a distance. James's brothers, Ethan and Caleb, had stayed, their search for gold replaced by the more profound discovery of a home they hadn't realized they'd lost. The three Carter men, united for the first time in a decade, worked to rebuild the ranch, their shared labor mending the fractured bonds of brotherhood. As the plains faded from gold to a brittle, weary brown, a deep and unusual cold began to settle in the bones of the land. The old-timers watched the sky, noted the behavior of the migrating birds, and muttered that it was a winter in the making, the likes of which hadn't been seen in 40 years. It came not with a whisper, but with a sudden, silent fury. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of lead, and the world went unnaturally still. Then, the first flakes began to drift down. Not the gentle, lazy flakes of a December morning, but small, hard pellets of ice that hissed as they hit the frozen ground. Within an hour, the air was a thick, blinding curtain of white, and a relentless wind began to howl out of the north, sculpting the falling snow into monstrous, shifting drifts. The Carter house, built to withstand Comanche raids and prairie fires, now faced a new siege. Its thick stone walls deadened the shriek of the wind to a low moan. Inside, the fires roared, and the larder was full. They were safe, an island of warmth and light in a world gone white and wild. On the second day of the storm, as James and his brothers were securing the last of the vulnerable cattle in the big barn, a rider appeared, a ghost struggling through the blizzard. It was one of the hands from a small neighboring ranch, His roof had collapsed, his firewood was gone, and his wife and children were freezing. That evening, as the family sat around the great stone hearth, Maggie spoke. "We have to bring people in." Ethan, the more cynical of the two younger brothers, shook his head. "These are the same people who were ready to let Blake's mob burn us out a few months ago. Let them weather their own storm." "No," Maggie said, her voice quiet but firm. She was now several months pregnant, and a new maternal authority had settled upon her. "No one deserves to freeze, not for ignorance, not for fear, not for anything." She looked at James, and in her eyes was the same challenge she had given him when she refused to leave for Austin. James looked into the fire, then at his wife. He had built this house to keep the world out. She was teaching him how to let it in. "She's right," he said. "His decision absolute. Saddle the strongest horses. We'll ride in pairs. Bring in anyone who can't make it on their own." For the next day, the Carter brothers and their most trusted men became a rescue party, fighting their way through waist-deep drifts to isolated homesteads and drafty townhouses. They brought back families, strangers, people who had once whispered about them, their faces a mixture of desperation, gratitude, and deep, humbling shame. The great house, once a symbol of lonely power, became a noisy, crowded sanctuary. Children played on the thick rugs, and women worked together in Rosa's kitchen. The old social divides erased by the common need for warmth and survival. On the fourth day of the storm, a pounding came at the main door. When Caleb opened it, he found two figures, covered in snow, half frozen. It was the new sheriff and clinging to his arm. A woman so bundled against the cold she was barely recognizable. When she pushed back her hood, a stunned silence fell over the hall. It was Eleanor Gable. Her face was gaunt, her usual mask of haughty pride shattered by fear and exhaustion. The chimney on her well-built house had collapsed, filling the rooms with smoke and leaving her without heat. She had been found by the sheriff during his final patrol of the town. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the scene of communal survival, and finally night landed on Maggie, who was approaching from the kitchen. All the venom, all the righteous indignation, was gone, replaced by the simple, stark terror of a woman who had come close to death. She said nothing. She couldn't. Maggie simply took her arm. "Rosa has hot broth on the stove," she said, her voice gentle, without a trace of triumph or recrimination. "Come and get warm." That night, as the blizzard reached its zenith, a new crisis began. Maggie felt the first, sharp pain low in her back. She tried to ignore it, but then another came, stronger this time. The baby was coming, weeks ahead of schedule. Panic was a cold whisper in the crowded house. The doctor was 20 miles away, an impossible distance. The men James, his brothers, the sheriff were suddenly useless, their strength and authority meaningless in the face of this elemental, female mystery. It was the women who took charge, shooing the men out of the master bedroom, their voices low and urgent as they boiled water and tore sheets for bindings. And it was Eleanor Gable who took command. The years of petty tyranny fell away, and the memory of raising 3 sons of her own rose to the surface. She was no longer Maggie's accuser. She was the only one in the room who truly knew what to do. "Get those blankets warmer," she ordered one woman, her voice sharp and practical. "You," she said to another, "keep a watch on her breathing." She knelt by the bed where Maggie lay, her face pale with pain and fear. She took Maggie's hand, her touch surprisingly steady. "You listen to me, girl," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "We are going to get through this, you and I. You just breathe." Through the long, agonizing hours of the night, as the storm raged outside, an unlikely alliance was forged in that room. The women who had once scorned Maggie now worked together to bring her child into the world. They held her hands, wiped her brow, and spoke to her in soft, encouraging tones. And at the head of it all was Eleanor, her pride washed away by the raw, urgent reality of birth. She coached Maggie through the pain, her instructions clear and direct, her experience a lifeline in a sea of fear. James paced the hall outside, his own powerlessness a torment. He could face down 30 armed men, but he could do nothing to ease his wife's suffering. He could only listen to her cries, his heart clenching with every sound. Just before dawn, as the wind outside finally began to abate, a new sound joined the storm. It was a thin, reedy cry, a sound of furious, indignant life. A moment later, the bedroom door opened. Eleanor Gable stood there, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with sweat and tears. She looked at James, and, for the first time, he saw her not as an adversary, but as a fellow human being, weary and profoundly moved. "You have a son," she said, her voice thick. "A fine, healthy boy." He pushed past her into the room. Maggie lay back against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, a small, tightly wrapped bundle in her arms. He knelt by the bed, his throat too tight to speak. He looked at his son, at his wife, and at the faces of the women gathered around the bed. In this room, in the heart of the storm, the fractures of the community had been healed. Forgiveness had been made manifest, not in words, but in the shared, sacred work of bringing a new life into the world. They named him Thomas. A week later, the storm had passed, leaving the world pristine and silent under a thick blanket of white. The roads were cleared enough for the mail rider to get through. He brought a stack of letters and a single telegram. It was for James. He opened it, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he looked up, his eyes finding Maggie's across the room, a look of quiet astonishment on his face. It was from the governor's office. In recognition of his integrity and leadership during the recent troubles in the county, he had been appointed to the State Cattlemen's Board. He held the telegram in his hand. It was a piece of paper, a formal acknowledgement from the world beyond their valley, but its meaning was profound. He had been an outcast, a man who had defied social convention for a principle. Now, that very defiance had become the source of his honor. The snow outside had washed the land clean, covering the scars of the fire and the dust of old animosities. And in his hands, he held the proof that a new season had truly begun. 5 years. The land measured time in the slow turning of the seasons, in the fattening of calves and the deepening of shadows cast by the afternoon sun. 5 years had passed since the great winter, and the valley had been reborn. The town of Willow Falls was no longer a dusty, fearful outpost held together by suspicion, but a place of purpose, its heartbeat steady and strong. The railroad, which had once seemed a distant dream, now had a spur line that terminated just outside of town, a slender steel artery connecting them to the wider world, where Amos Blake's saloon had once cast its long, ugly shadow. There now stood the Willow Falls Community Hall, its windows clean, its porch wide and welcoming. Inside, it hosted town meetings, quilting bees, and Saturday night dances where the music of a fiddle spilled out into the clean night air. Next to it was a small clinic, run by a young doctor Maggie had convinced to settle there, his practice subsidized by a cooperative formed by the ranchers and merchants. But the town's proudest achievement stood at the end of the main street, a sturdy clapboard building with a shingled roof and a bright brass bell in a small belfry. It was Maggie's schoolhouse. No longer a dream in a converted line shack, but a reality built of fresh-cut pine and community will. Every morning, the clear, bright ring of its bell was a promise, a sound of the future. Inside, children whose parents had once been on opposite sides of a bitter feud now learned their letters side by side. The sons of vaqueros sat next to the daughters of merchants, their differences forgotten in the shared challenge of long division. The divisions of the past had been buried, not by decree, but by the simple, undeniable logic of shared hope for their children. The Carter Ranch had changed. Too, it was still a fortress, but its gates were now open. The great stone house, once a monument to one man's solitude, had become the valley's heart. Tom Brennan, His limp a little more pronounced, but his smile more frequent, was a constant presence, the gruff, doting godfather to young Thomas Carter. Rosa, her hair now more silver than black, had become the grandmother to every child on the ranch, her kitchen a haven of warm tortillas and gentle wisdom. Maggie, her belly round with their second child, stood on the schoolhouse porch, watching the children play in the yard. Her son, Thomas, a sturdy 4-year-old with his father's serious eyes and her determined chin, was chasing a ball with the sheriff's daughter. Seeing them, so innocent of the old hatreds, was a constant, quiet affirmation of everything they had fought for. That afternoon, the governor of Texas paid a visit to Willow Falls. He stood on the steps of the new community hall, a polished politician from the city, looking out at the assembled townsfolk. He had heard the stories of the valley's transformation, of its cooperative and its newfound prosperity. "I have traveled all over this great state," he declared, his voice booming, "but I have never seen anything quite like what you have accomplished here. It is a miracle, a true Texas miracle." Standing at the back of the crowd, James Carter smiled faintly. He put his arm around Maggie's shoulders, and she leaned her head against his chest. A miracle, no. It was something far more tangible and difficult. It was 5 years of relentless work. It was Tom Brennan organizing the co-op, James's brothers negotiating fair freight prices with the railroad, and Maggie sitting up late at night balancing the clinic's books. It was the disciplined application of kindness, the daily choice to build rather than to break. It was the hard, slow, unglamorous labor of forging a community. Later that day, as the sun began its long descent, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, James took Thomas by the hand. "Come on, son," he said. "There's something I want to show you." Maggie walked with them, her steps slower now, but just as steady. They didn't take the horses. They walked the familiar path down to Willow Creek, to the quiet, secluded grove of cottonwoods. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp earth and the sound of the creek murmuring its endless story. The pool was just as she remembered it, clear and still, reflecting the painted sky. Thomas, free from his father's hand, ran to the water's edge, chasing a dragonfly. James and Maggie stopped beneath the shade of the great, ancient cottonwood, the one that had witnessed his proposal. But it was not the only tree there now. Standing in a neat, straight line leading away from it were 5 young oak trees, each one taller and stronger than the last. "One for every year," Maggie said softly, running her hand over the rough bark of the nearest one. "A forest in the making." James sat on the grassy bank, pulling his son onto his lap. Thomas looked up at him, his face full of a child's open curiosity. "Papa, is this where you live?" James chuckled, a low, warm sound. "No, son, but this is where I started to live." He looked over at Maggie, his eyes full of a love that had deepened and broadened with every passing year. "A long time ago," he began, his voice quiet, meant for both his son and his wife. "Papa was a very lonely man. He had a big house and a lot of land, but his heart was like a fortress, with stone walls all around it. He thought that was how you had to be strong." He pointed across the pool. "And one morning, right over there, he saw your mother. She was here all by herself, and she looked so free." And Papa realized that true strength wasn't in the walls you build to keep people out. It's in having the courage to let someone in. He smoothed Thomas's hair back from his forehead. "That was the day I saw your mother at Willow Creek. That was the day your father learned how to take off his armor." Thomas didn't understand all the words, but he understood the love in his father's voice. He leaned his head back against his father's chest, content. James reached out his hand to Maggie, and she took it, her fingers lacing with his. They sat there together, a family, watching their son by the water. The 5 young oaks stood as silent witnesses to their promise, choosing each other forever. They had discovered was not a single, dramatic vow made in the face of a fire. It was a promise renewed every single morning. It was in the ringing of the schoolhouse bell, in the fair price paid for a farmer's grain, in the comfort offered to a sick neighbor. It was in the daily, patient work of teaching a child his letters, of fighting back the dust and the drought, of speaking the truth and of protecting the vulnerable. It was the act of planting a tree, year after year, with faith that it would one day grow to shelter a world you had built together. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.